History is often presented to us as a linear, understandable record. However, the most amazing secrets are often hidden in plain sight, captured in the art of past centuries. If we cast aside our usual skepticism and turn to the artistic heritage of the 18th century, especially the works of Italian masters, a picture of the world opens up before us that completely overturns our ideas about ancient civilizations. The works of that period serve not merely as museum decorations, but perhaps as the most vivid evidence of the existence of giants in the relatively recent past. It is important to understand the context of the era. In those times, before photography was invented, technologies for capturing reality were different, but no less developed. Italian artists of the 1700s were famous for their striving for absolute accuracy. Their paintings are not the product of wild fantasy, but a documentary chronicle transferred to canvas with photographic detail. These masters conveyed reality exactly as it was, without distortion or allegory. It is precisely this fact that makes what is depicted on their canvases so intriguing and even frightening for the modern observer. Upon close examination of the cityscapes of that time, a striking detail is revealed. On busy squares and streets, people of completely different proportions coexist. This is not an optical illusion or a mistake in perspective. We see ordinary people, our ancestors, whose dimensions match ours, and walking right next to them are figures whose height significantly exceeds accepted norms. We are not talking about children and adults, but about fully formed people who differ from each other only in scale. This is a humanity where giants and people of ordinary height exist in a single space, side by side. The scenes in the paintings are devoid of drama or conflict, which speaks to the everyday nature of such a neighborhood. This is the ordinary life of an 18th century city. However, social stratification is also noticeable. The larger people are typically depicted in rich clothing, resembling the attire of the aristocracy and nobility. They occupy a confident position in society, while people of our usual height are dressed more modestly and often fulfill the role of service staff or simple townsfolk. This visual evidence suggests the hypothesis that the giants of that time were not only distinguished by physical power, but also occupied a dominant position in the social hierarchy, serving as the elite of that world. It is unlikely that Italian realists, whose task was to immortalize the greatness of their cities, would massively introduce such strange, fantastic elements into their work if they had no relation to reality. Most likely, they simply painted what they saw every day from their windows. We are looking at our own past, where our species lived in the shadow of more powerful beings. And if we accept this fact as given, if we agree that the artists were not lying when they depicted people of different heights, then the next, even more intriguing question arises. What kind of worlds did they live in? After all, beings of such size required appropriate space. If you look at the architecture surrounding these characters, it seems too majestic and monumental for an ordinary person, as if this entire world of stone was designed and built not for us at all. When we shift our gaze from the mysterious figures of the characters to the architectural background that surrounds them, an even more striking picture reveals itself. The environment captured on ancient canvases, as well as that which has survived in stone to this day, is silent but irrefutable proof that modern man occupies a place in these cities that was not originally intended for him. We are accustomed to admiring the grandeur of ancient buildings, their monumentality and scale, attributing the gigantic dimensions to the architect's desire for pomp and the wish to impress descendants. However, if we discard art history cliches and look at these buildings from the point of view of dry logic and functionality, it becomes obvious. These structures were designed based on completely different anthropometric data.
Buildings constructed in the so-called antique style possessed proportions that cause a deep sense of dissonance in a person of ordinary height. Huge window openings, stretching meters upward, and door portals through which a rider could freely pass without bowing his head, seem excessive for people of our height. Why create a door 5 or 6 meters high if the average height of a resident does not exceed 1.70 meters? From the point of view of heat conservation and ease of use, this is nonsense. Such rooms are difficult to heat, and huge door leaves are heavy to open. But everything falls into place if we assume that these parameters were dictated not by aesthetics, but by ergonomics. For a creature ranging from 3 to 4 meters tall, such doorways and high ceilings are not a luxury, but a banal necessity, ensuring comfortable movement and life. Just as a standard 2-meter doorway is the norm for us. This architectural gigantomania correlates perfectly with the social stratification observed in the paintings. Giants dressed in expensive aristocratic clothes look absolutely harmonious in these settings. They are proportionate to the columns, arches, and staircases. Their figures naturally fit into the space of huge halls and wide terraces. At the same time, people of our current height look like children or random passers-by wandering into someone else's palace against the backdrop of these cyclopean structures. We see how little people huddle at the foot of giant plinths. Their way of life seems primitive against the background of the high-tech stone processing from which the cities are built. This observation confirms the hypothesis that it was the giants who were the ruling elite, for whose needs and dimensions this material world was created. Ordinary people apparently only served this civilization, or coexisted with it in secondary roles, using infrastructure created not for them. Even today, looking at the preserved architectural monuments, be they cathedrals with their heavenly vaults or administrative buildings of past centuries, we are forced to admit we live in the ruins of a more advanced civilization. We adapt these spaces for ourselves, inserting additional floors to break one giant story into 2 suitable for living, shrinking doorways and installing elevators where the steps are too steep. We behave like new tenants who have moved into a giant's house that is too big in the shoulders for us. Official history tries to convince us that our ancestors built this all with primitive tools for abstract greatness, but common sense suggests otherwise. These cities were built by giants and for giants. A persistent, almost physical feeling arises that we are living in someone else's stage set. It is as if humanity moved into an abandoned city built for a race of titans, and now we are trying to adapt this world to our modest dimensions, not noticing how ridiculous we look against the backdrop of the cyclopean grandeur. We walk through streets that are too wide for us, enter doors whose handles would originally have been above our heads, and look out of windows whose sills are at our chest level. The scale of the deception becomes obvious. We have been convinced that we are the pinnacle of evolution and the builders of this world, while the facts scream that we are merely dwarves wandering among the ruins of greater predecessors. Of course, any critical thinker will immediately ask a logical question, one often used by skeptics to destroy the giant theory. If all these buildings were built for people 3 meters tall, why then are the steps of the stairs leading to these temples and palaces of a quite standard size familiar to us? It would seem inconvenient for a giant to shuffle along tiny steps. However, this contradiction has a frightening and completely logical answer, which opens an even darker page of our history. First of all, we should not forget the possibility of coexistence. If we accept the hypothesis that giants were the ruling elite and people of ordinary height made up the serving class or simply lived nearby, then the architecture had to take into account the interests of both. But a different scenario connected with global changes in the appearance of cities seems more likely. We often ignore the traces of catastrophe that literally lie beneath our feet. Photographs of excavations from the early 20th century in Rome, Moscow, St. Petersburg, and other old cities demonstrate the same picture. The first floors of buildings are deeply submerged in the ground. Streets are buried under meters of dense clay and earth. This is the famous cultural layer, which official science explains as the accumulation of trash, but which looks more like the consequences of a massive mud flow or flood. In this context, small stairs receive a simple explanation. This is the result of later adaptation. After the giant civilization disappeared or was destroyed by a cataclysm, surviving people of our height began to inhabit the surviving monumental structures. They dug out entrances, remodeled interiors, broke huge halls into floors, and of course, relaid stairs to make them comfortable for themselves, or they built new flights of stairs on top of the ruined giant steps. We see the result of reconstruction, not the original design. History was intentionally sanitized. Those who came to power after the catastrophe rewrote the chronicles, removed mentions of giants from textbooks, turning them into myths and fairy tales. But they could not destroy millions of tons of stone. The buildings remained as silent witnesses, but their true purpose was distorted to please the new paradigm. We were told that we built these majestic structures with primitive chisels, and we believed it, despite the obvious absurdity of this claim. Buildings can indeed be rebuilt, stairs relaid, and doorways bricked up to reduce them to the necessary size. But what about objects that cannot be changed? There are artifacts that break any attempt to explain their existence from the point of view of the anthropometry of an ordinary person. In museums and private collections around the world, there are things that a person of our height physically could not use, and these objects are neither symbolic nor ritualistic. Take, for example, ancient folios. We are not talking simply about big books, but about giant tomes weighing up to 40 to 50 kilograms, with a binding height exceeding a meter. The official version states that this was done for symmetry or to fit more text, but try to imagine the process of reading such a book. For an ordinary person to turn one page, they need to stand up, use both hands, and exert significant physical effort. Reading such a text while sitting at a table is impossible. The letters are huge, and the human field of vision does not cover the page entirely. But for a creature 3 to 4 meters tall, such a book would be equivalent to our standard A4 format. The font, line spacing, paper thickness, everything is calculated for giant hands and eyes located at a completely different height. An even more graphic example is weapons. Museums display two-handed swords, Zweihanders and claymores, whose length exceeds 2 meters, and whose weight is such that only a trained athlete can lift them, and then only for a short time. To speak of fencing with such monsters in real combat is ridiculous. The inertia of such a blade would make its owner easy prey after the very first swing. Historians claim these are ceremonial weapons, but many blades have notches, traces of blows, and resharpening, indicating that they were actively used in battles. By whom? By a man who would get tired just holding it up, or by a warrior for whom this sword was a standard lightsaber? The same applies to firearms. Giant muskets, which are today called wall guns, have stocks that are impossible for an ordinary person to brace against their shoulder. The trigger is too far away. We are told that they were operated by crews of 2 people, but the design of the stock clearly points to individual use by a creature with long arms and broad shoulders. Let's not forget musical instruments. Huge double basses and cellos preserved from those times require a musician to have superhuman finger spans and arm lengths. For an ordinary virtuoso to play a full piece on them is extremely difficult, if not impossible. All these objects, books, swords, guns, instruments, were created with perfect ergonomics in mind, but the ergonomics of a species not ours. This is not symbolism or hyperbole. These are the everyday items of real giants who once held them in their hands just as naturally as we hold smartphones. And if the material evidence is so obvious in Europe, it is logical to assume that traces of this race must be recorded in other corners of the planet. If the geographical scope of artifacts seems limited, one only needs to broaden the horizons and look at the heritage of other great civilizations to understand. Giants were a global phenomenon that knew no borders. Traces of their presence stretch across continents and millennia, from the sands of ancient Egypt to the Gothic vaults of medieval Europe, forming a single stone chronicle that we stubbornly refuse to read literally. Ancient Egypt provides perhaps the most extensive and vivid material. The walls of temples and tombs are covered with bas-reliefs and frescoes, where the same plot repeats with frightening regularity. Figures of enormous height stand next to people who barely reach their knees. Official Egyptology has fed us a convenient explanation for decades, calling this hierarchical perspective. Scholars claim that the size of the figure in the drawing depended exclusively on social status. The pharaoh was depicted as a giant because he was godlike, and his servants and enemies as small to emphasize their insignificance. But if we discard this imposed dogma and assume that ancient artists, who possessed incredible skill in anatomy and architecture, simply recorded reality, everything falls into place. This is not an allegory of power, but a documentary depiction of biological difference. We see not metaphorical giants, but real rulers towering over their subjects in the literal sense of the word. Similar evidence can be found in the heart of Europe in the sculptural compositions of ancient cathedrals. Look closely at the statues of knights and saints adorning the facades and interiors of temples. Often next to these majestic figures, animals are depicted, lions, bulls, or war horses. But their proportions cause bewilderment. A fearsome lion next to a warrior looks no more than a lapdog, barely reaching the knee, and a riding horse seems like a pony whose back is at the waist level of the person standing next to it. Art historians rush again to explain this as an inability to observe proportions or the symbolic meaning of the victory of spirit over flesh. However, common sense suggests that sculptors capable of carving the finest lace from stone and conveying emotions on a face were unlikely to be massively mistaken in the size of a horse. It is more likely that the animals were ordinary sized, but the people standing next to them were true giants. Too many coincidences are scattered around the world to consider this an accident or the collective fantasy of artists from different eras and cultures. Statues of Buddha, antique colossi, Egyptian bas-reliefs, and medieval engravings, they all speak the same language, the language of giantism. They try to explain to us that in the past, people thought exclusively in symbols, ignoring reality. But perhaps there is much more common sense in ancient art than in modern history textbooks. Everyday objects, architecture, and images fit together into a single puzzle, proving that a race surpassing ours in all parameters once existed on Earth. However, if the evidence of their existence is so obvious and tangible, the most important and disturbing question arises, one that gives researchers no peace. Where did this powerful civilization disappear to? What could wipe off the face